7:58 a.m. Gate D14 at San Diego International Airport was packed with travelers. First-class passengers on flight OS 111 to Washington, D.C. stood in an uneasy line, not because they were running late, but because the boarding system had been malfunctioning since the previous night. Malik Avery approached with a calm that felt out of place amid the growing tension. He didn't stand out. No expensive watch, no luxurious leather luggage, just a black man, about 39 years old, wearing a simple black hoodie, gray khakis, carrying a worn leather crossbody bag, and a carefully folded boarding pass with the name printed clearly. Avery Malik, First Class, Seat 2A, Priority 1. His gaze moved quietly across the front rows, confident but not boastful, as if he had belonged in that space all along. But just as he stepped onto the red carpet leading into the first-class cabin, a woman's voice cut through the air firm without greeting. "Excuse me, you can't sit in 2A. That ticket appears to be fake." The voice belonged to Candace Nolan, the flight's lead attendant, a woman with copper blonde hair, piercing eyes, and a tone shaped by years of enforcing authority with a single glance. Malik paused, not out of anger, but at the bluntness of her statement, as if he didn't just not belong in seat 2A, but didn't belong in the cabin at all. He didn't reply, simply raised the ticket in front of her. Candace glanced at it for barely 2 seconds before nodding, as if the answer had already been decided in her mind. "You're not on the list. This seat is reserved for full-paying passengers. We don't accept employee passes or complimentary upgrades." Malik still said nothing. He simply furrowed his brow slightly. "My name is Avery Malik. This is my ticket." Candace frowned, but before she could respond, another voice chimed in from inside the cabin. "Maybe he picked that up off the floor. He doesn't exactly look like someone who flies up here." It was Brent Halverson, a middle-aged businessman in a navy blue suit, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone as though stating something universally understood. The comment, though casual, shifted the attention of the cabin. Some passengers looked on with curiosity, others with discomfort, a few with undisguised annoyance. Malik didn't move. He kept his gaze fixed on Candace, his voice low but firm. "I didn't pick up anyone's ticket. Your system may be flawed, but I'm not." Candace crossed her arms, her eyes now set with the resolve of someone about to summon security. "We've had a number of fraud attempts this morning. Maybe your card was rejected at the kiosk because it wasn't valid. And you're dressed like—" She didn't finish, but her eyes swept over his hoodie and clean sneakers, speaking volumes. Behind Malik, a younger man in a gray shirt was recording the entire scene on his phone without hiding it. That was Noah Ellis, Malik's personal assistant, silent for now. Just one row away, a young woman, Jade Monroe, a freelance journalist, had already started filming with her small handheld camera. She focused the lens on Candace, her gaze locked on the stewardess's cold expression. Malik remained still, his eyes fixed on the woman blocking his path. "If you want to verify something, I suggest you do it professionally. Don't jump to accusations, especially not in front of people who are recording every word you say." Candace narrowed her eyes. "Are you threatening me?" Malik shook his head, voice steady as calm water before a storm. "I'm giving you one last chance to do the right thing before the words you just spoke become the beginning of the end." The moment Candace Nolan dismissed every explanation and took half a step back to call security, the air inside the first-class cabin of Flight OS 111 seemed to freeze. But strangely, that silence triggered a rustle camera shutters, phone clicks, and hushed murmurs began to ripple through the cabin. Some passengers who at first had no idea what was happening were now turning their heads, whispering as if caught in the middle of an unfolding play they didn't ask to be part of but couldn't ignore. And in the soft glow of sunlight coming through the left window, the image of Malik Avery still standing tall, unflinching, holding his ticket, gaze steady as if flipping through a page of worn history, suddenly lent the scene an inexplicable gravity. No one spoke until a young woman's voice rose from seat 3A. I'm filming this because I've seen it before and it usually ends with the person being mistreated staying silent. It was Jade Monroe, the independent journalist who had remained quiet since boarding. Now she aimed her camera directly at Candace. "No one is threatening anyone here," she said. "Just one man being denied a basic right without any actual verification." Candace, visibly flustered, hid her hands behind her back. But before she could respond, Eric Powell, the seat service attendant, stepped in from the galley, glanced at Malik's ticket, then checked the handheld device in his palm. After a few seconds, he shook his head. "The name isn't on the display list." Malik turned to Noah, his voice low, meant for one person alone. "You're recording, right?" Noah gave a small nod. "Recording, audio's clear, image stable, 8:04 a.m., every word logged since the boarding gate." Candace lowered her voice, maybe realizing how far this had gone. But Brent Halverson wasn't done, chiming in with a smug chuckle. "I've flown Orion Sky for over a decade and never seen someone in a hoodie and a cloth bag in 2A. Sorry, but you can just tell he doesn't belong here." The comment didn't just sting Malik, it made Jade raise her camera and lock the frame on Brent's face, her tone sharp. "Did you just define who can or can't sit in a premium seat by their fabric or their skin color?" Malik turned to face the whole cabin, letting his voice travel further than just the seat ahead. "I've been in rooms where people looked at me and made up their minds without reading my name, without scanning my badge. And each time they thought I would stay quiet." He paused for a beat, as if to let the silence affirm his words, then turned back to Candace. "But not today." Candace tilted her head toward Eric, but he only shrugged, clearly indicating the system still didn't reflect Malik's name. Jade spoke again, not to anyone in particular, but as if narrating a truth out loud. "He has the ticket, the name matches, the priority tag is printed clearly. A delayed system doesn't erase reality. But you, Candace, chose to trust a screen instead of verifying identity with your own eyes." Only now did Malik slowly reach into his bag and pull out his Orion Sky internal ID, a card bearing his photo, full name, and shareholder code. He held it out toward Candace. "If you truly care about safety and transparency, this is where it begins. Otherwise, you've just insulted not only a passenger, but the largest shareholder of this airline." And at that moment, the cabin from the galley to the aisle was filled only with the soft clicks of Noah and Jade's cameras, the quiet hum of the plane's systems, and the subtle shift of dozens of eyes beginning to realize they weren't just witnessing an argument, but the beginning of a reckoning. The silence that followed Malik Avery's final words seemed to suck all the air from the cabin. Candace Nolan stood frozen, her hand suspended in midair as she stared at the Orion Sky internal ID card bearing the name Malik Avery, Executive Shareholder, 40% Equity. Her eyes wavered not from surprise but from indecision, unsure whether to deny, deflect, or retreat. But before any reaction could take form, Eric Powell blurted out from the side, "That name wouldn't show up on the list because if the kiosk flags it, the system auto-shifts it to economy. Maybe Candace marked it wrong." What was intended as a rescue line instead flung open the door to a truth now exposed to dozens of witnesses and a camera still recording. Malik turned toward Eric. "What did you just say? Marked?" Eric blinked rapidly, as if realizing he had just confessed something that should never have been said. "No, I mean, there's an algorithm. If a ticket triggers a flag due to unusual payment, sometimes the system reroutes it for manual review." Malik lowered his voice, each word landing like a drumbeat against the seatbacks. "And when that happens, who decides to send it to economy? The system, or you using your own eyes and personal instinct?" By now, Candace had completely lost her composure. Arms folded tightly across her chest, she braced herself. "We're trained to observe indicators, clothing, behavior, reactions. These are factors used to identify risk." Malik stepped forward slightly. "No, that's not training. That's codified bias, and you've disguised it as safety intuition to make it sound legitimate." Brent Halverson, no longer smug, turned his face away from Jade's camera lens. But Jade didn't flinch, her frame still locked on Candace, watching each crack in her defense begin to show. Eric looked at Malik, eyes caught between regret and caution. We were never told explicitly to discriminate. Just that if someone didn't dress the usual way, we were advised to double-check. Malik nodded. So if a passenger isn't in a suit, doesn't carry a leather bag, or wear an expensive watch, that's reason enough to be suspicious? Eric didn't answer, but his silence said everything. Jade whispered, "This is profiling, just trained into habit." Candace snapped back. "I followed protocol. The ticket was rejected initially. The system didn't accept it." Malik gestured quietly to Noah. "What time was the card rejected?" Noah responded immediately. 7:52 a.m. kiosk B3. 3 failed credit card read system glitch. Payment terminal temporarily offline. Confirmed by IT. Malik nodded. "And afterward, who re-entered the passenger's information?" Eric answered softly. "Candace." The cabin fell completely still. Malik didn't need to speak another word. A single look from him pulled every data point and piece of evidence back to one single breaking point. Candace's decision, based on subjective judgment, had erased his name from the seat he rightfully owned. And now, before Jade's camera and Noah's phone, it wasn't just a system error, it was an act that could rewrite Orion Sky's entire policy. Malik locked eyes with Candace, his voice deep and calm like cold water drawn from a well. "I wasn't removed from this seat because of a system failure. I was erased by your gaze and by what that gaze chose to believe was true." Around the cabin, people glanced at one another, a few bowing their heads. No one could pretend they didn't see what had happened, and in that moment no one could say, "I didn't know." At 8:11 a.m., while the first-class cabin door remained open and what seemed like a minor dispute between a passenger and a flight attendant unfolded, no one realized they were standing at the fragile boundary between a personal incident and a cultural reckoning. Malik Avery still stood in place, not angry, not shouting, but each of his words peeled back a thick curtain that had long shielded the truth most had grown used to ignoring. Candace Nolan's breathing turned shallow, not from haste, but from the sense that every familiar argument was slipping through her fingers. She looked around for support, a sympathetic glance, but every eye was focused on the phone in Noah's hand and Jade's camera lens, as if truth no longer lived in words, but in the frames being recorded. Brent Halverson, now stripped of his earlier smugness, adjusted his tie without saying a word. Malik looked toward him, his voice low and steady. "You seem used to judging who deserves to sit where based on appearances. Have you ever considered that the people you assume don't belong might be the very ones holding the largest stakes in the companies you trust?" Brent didn't respond, but a few passengers nearby nodded slightly, some tapping on their phones, others leaning forward to listen more closely. These small shifts in movement signaled something larger. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed. Eric Powell, once Candace's quiet support, now inched backward, avoiding Malik's gaze. But as Candace moved toward the intercom to call security, Jade's voice rang out, just loud enough to hear. "If you call security now, that's no longer a professional response, it's a personal retaliation. And you know full well my camera is capturing every second." Candace froze. Her hand clutched the headset, but she didn't press the button. Perhaps deep down she knew. Once that line was crossed, there would be no taking it back. Malik turned slowly to Noah. "Send a verification code to executive contact. Note, first-class passenger seat 2A denied access based on appearance." Noah nodded, fingers gliding across his screen. "Sent. Confirmation from executive contact expected within 5 minutes." Malik gave the faintest smile, not one of victory, but of someone familiar with waiting and turning that patience into the foundation for lasting change. At that moment, a voice called out from the front of the cabin. Jack Donnelly, a seasoned passenger seated in 1C in his early 50s, spoke clearly enough for all to hear. I've flown Orion Sky for 14 years and never seen a handling this poor. If you're not manually verifying the passenger list, this is no longer a system error." Candace tightened her lips. "The manifest was preloaded. We don't," Jack cut her off. "Then it's the airline's failure, not the passengers." Jade panned her lens toward Jack. Malik gave him a slight nod, a gesture heavy with acknowledgement. He turned back to Candace, his gaze now gentler but still unwavering. "I was denied once before, 10 years ago. For the same reason someone saw me in a hoodie, traveling alone, and decided I couldn't possibly belong. I didn't respond. I just scaled up my company." He paused briefly, then added, "But not this time. Because this time I'm not just holding a ticket, I'm carrying the responsibility to make things right." No one interjected. And in that moment, no one mistook silence for submission. Because clearly Malik Avery was proving that some forms of power don't need to raise their voice. They only need to be spoken by the right person at the right time. At exactly 8:14 a.m., when the clock on Noah's phone ticked over, the first response from Orion Sky headquarters appeared. "Verification in progress. Internal network has received urgent priority request. Identifier code, Avery MK40. Malik gave a slight nod, not because his identity had been confirmed, but because everything was proceeding as it should, not driven by emotion, but by principle. Candace Nolan stood frozen in the aisle. She hadn't pressed the button to call security, but neither had she retracted her accusation. She seemed caught between an outdated belief that intuition could replace verification and a present reality that could no longer be denied. Seat 2A was no longer just a seat. It had become a reminder that power doesn't always wear ties and collared shirts. Jade Monroe, the young journalist with her camera still rolling, spoke up suddenly, her voice firm, though not loud. "Candace, all you had to do was verify his ID and boarding information, but instead, you chose to insult him in front of everyone." That statement wasn't aimed at just one person. It struck at an unspoken policy long embedded in practice that dressing incorrectly could get you flagged, excluded, even perceived as a potential threat. No evidence required. Just a glance. Eric Powell, the second attendant, now began to breathe heavier. He knew well that the passenger hierarchy system was never formally documented, yet it lived in every staff meeting, every shift, every so-called instinctual precaution. Malik turned to him, his voice low but weighted with accountability. "Have you ever heard someone say that loose clothing, hoodies, or canvas bags were red flags?" Eric gave a faint nod without looking up. "Not officially, but it was in internal training." Malik tilted his head. "Then that means it exists." The entire cabin seemed to tighten with silence. Brent Halverson, who once scoffed, now turned his face away, unable to hold on to any semblance of confidence. At that moment, an older woman seated in row 3 spoke clearly. "I'm a frequent flyer here, but today I'm ashamed of what I'm witnessing." Candace, pushed to the edge of her rational limits, burst out, "I didn't do this because of skin color. I did it because someone once boarded first class with a fake ticket." Malik didn't respond. He simply turned to Noah and gestured. Mark that moment. Noah nodded. 8:15. Logged. Attendant admits reassigning passenger based on suspicion from appearance, no ID or card verification conducted before accusation. No one said anything. No one needed to. The truth at that point had become too clear to deny. Candace stepped back toward the galley, her hands trembling. She seemed ready to speak again, but Jade turned the camera on herself and whispered just loud enough to be heard. "This is no longer a story about a seat. This is a story about human worth and the price we pay when we forfeit it over an ignorant assumption." Malik remained standing, silent, but his silence had become the loudest voice in the first-class cabin. Because when truth begins to speak through action, every excuse becomes irrelevant. And at that very moment, Noah's phone buzzed a second time. On the screen appeared, "Identity confirmed, shareholder Malik Avery, seat 2A, priority level 1. System error acknowledged. All flight attendants ordered to cease further intervention." Jade lifted her eyes, her voice no longer that of a recorder, but of a witness to history. And once again, Truth prevails over assumption. As the final confirmation from Orion Sky's operations team appeared on Noah's phone screen, the first-class cabin fell into a silence of a very different kind. It wasn't the silence of confusion, but a suspended moment between two timelines before and after the truth was officially recognized by the system. Candace Nolan stepped all the way back, her gaze unfocused as she read the words Malik Avery, executive shareholder, priority 1. The proof was there now, no longer in her hands, but within the very system she had used as a shield to deny a man. And now, that same system reflected the very mistake she had claimed to defend. Jade kept filming, her eyes fixed on Candace, no longer judging but clearly warning. She wasn't pushing the moment further, only refusing to let it be buried. Malik, still composed, took one step toward the service counter at the front of the cabin, where the printed passenger list lay beside a tablet device. He picked it up, turned a few pages, then looked at Eric Powell and asked softly, "This printed list, was it updated with the latest system feedback?" Eric stammered, "No, it hasn't been updated yet after the payment system error." Malik nodded. "So my name wasn't missing because I wasn't a passenger, but because you didn't update in time." Eric bowed his head and confirmed, his voice shaking. Jack Donnelly rose from seat 1C and spoke firmly. "Then the issue isn't with the passenger. It's with how the crew responded to a technical delay." Jade swung her camera toward him. Jack didn't flinch. He even looked directly into the lens. "I used to be head of operations at a small airline. And I'll tell you this, if an outdated list alone is enough for a flight crew to remove a passenger without verifying identity, then this isn't a mistake. It's a flawed cultural system." Candace lifted her head, offering a weak rebuttal. "I didn't mean to. I was just following protocol." But Malik cut in immediately. "You weren't following protocol. You skipped the ID verification step and instead used your own instinct to determine my place." Then he turned to Noah. "Open the audio file. Mark the timestamp for skipped ID verification seat reassignment based on instinct." Noah nodded, fingers moving quickly. Malik's voice remained steady and never rose. "You say it wasn't about race, but you didn't need to say it. Your actions made that perfectly clear." Eric spoke up then, slow and weighed down with remorse. "We've received similar complaints in the past, passengers being treated differently when they didn't dress like a typical first-class flyer. But those complaints never reached upper management." Jade asked directly. "Why not?" Eric hesitated. "Because if the crew receives too many complaints about discrimination, the lead gets temporarily suspended, so we handled it internally." Malik closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked directly at him. "You didn't handle it internally. You buried the truth." The entire cabin now sat in silence like a courtroom. Malik turned toward the passengers, and his voice now carried not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been quietly denied. Truth doesn't need to be angry. It just needs to be seen. And today, it cannot be silenced again. A few passengers nodded. Some gently touched the arm of the person next to them. No one dared speak loudly, because they all knew this moment had already become the loudest voice for everything that had once been kept quiet. As the atmosphere in the cabin thickened with the weight of truth and the gravity of every word spoken, Candace Nolan stood frozen by the service counter. In her hand, she still held the crew headset, but clearly the only connection left now wasn't with the cockpit or operations center. It was with her own conscience, which had been steadily eroding with each minute the incident was laid bare before everyone. Malik Avery walked slowly toward her, not to intimidate, but to close the final distance between a man in power and someone who had once misused it. His voice wasn't sharp, just a cold breeze brushing against the cracks in a fading mask. "I'm giving you a chance not to keep your job, but to keep your self-respect. Tell the truth, here, in front of everyone." Candace hesitated, her eyes scanning the cabin where not a single look remained to offer her sympathy. Lucas, her longtime co-worker, now kept his head down. Eric had stepped back against the wall, his shoulders trembling. No one stood by her, not a single person. At last, she spoke, her words unraveling like a fraying thread pulled from a desperate grip. I marked your name not to erase you, but because I doubted the ticket was real. I've seen a similar case. Once. Malik didn't respond. He simply looked at her. And it was that silence that compelled Candace to go on, no longer hiding. I didn't check your ID, I just saw the hoodie, the sneakers, no watch, no membership card, and I assumed someone like that couldn't be in seat 2A. The confession landed in the cabin like a sudden jolt cutting through still water. Jade kept her lens locked in, capturing every expression not to shame, but to document. Jack Donnelly sat up straight. So you admit you judge someone entirely on appearance? Candace nodded, her eyes red with emotion. But then, something unexpected happened. Lucas stepped forward, his voice cracking. She's not the only one. We were trained that if a passenger didn't dress to first-class standards, baggy clothes, no membership tag, sneakers, we were to flag and re-verify. It's not in the manuals, but it's repeated in briefings. The entire cabin held its breath. Malik tilted his head slightly and said to Noah, "Mark the time, 8:21 a.m. Admission by lead crew member Lucas Powell. Unofficial training protocols included appearance-based profiling." Noah confirmed. Candace leaned forward as if trying to salvage something. "But I didn't do it because of race. I did it because I was afraid of making a mistake." Malik didn't lash out. He simply replied, his voice slicing clean. "You weren't afraid of mistakes. You were afraid of people who didn't match what you thought was right, and that is the root of the mistake." No one defended her anymore. Brent Halverson still sat with his head down, stripped of the pompous smirk he once wore so easily. Jade lowered her camera to her chest and looked at Malik. "Now that everything's clear, what will you do?" Malik didn't answer right away. He looked into the faces around the cabin where the lies had been exposed, where the truth had spoken, and only then did he reply, his voice forged in restraint and steel. "I'm not seeking revenge. I'm seeking transparency. And today, it begins right here in seat 2A. The air inside the cabin had grown still. The silence was no longer the weight of misunderstanding, but the tense calm before an inevitable shift. Malik Avery stepped toward the center of the cabin, where every gaze seemed magnetically drawn to him. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to gesture. His presence, now no longer just a passenger, was enough to affirm the authority of truth. "I won't ask for an apology," he said slowly, each word cutting through the surface of pretense like a blade. "Because an apology cannot erase a system that allowed prejudice to quietly take root. But I will make a decision." Candace Nolan gripped her headset tightly, then released it, as if she too knew exactly what was coming. Malik looked straight at her, then turned to Lucas Powell, his eyes no longer those of someone wounded, but of someone weighing justice. "Candace Nolan, under my authority as executive shareholder at Orion Sky, I hereby suspend you from all passenger-facing duties, effective immediately. HR will oversee your transition. At this point, your actions are no longer individual. They represent a culture that must change." Candace opened her mouth as if to speak, but the stares of the surrounding passengers spoke in her place. No more support, no more defense. Lucas took a breath, bracing himself for his own verdict. Malik continued, measured and deliberate. "Mr. Powell, as lead flight attendant, you enabled a public accusation without verification and allowed a passenger to be humiliated before the entire cabin. However, I will not terminate you. You'll be reassigned to the internal compliance team and begin retraining, with a formal disciplinary record entered into the system." Lucas bowed his head. "I understand, and I accept." Malik paused briefly, then turned to Brent Halverson, the man who had casually uttered that first cutting remark. "Mr. Halverson, you are not an employee of Orion Sky, so I cannot discipline you. But I can and I will enforce our zero-tolerance service policy. As executive shareholder, I hereby ban you from all Orion Sky flights and domestic partner carriers, effective upon landing." Brent shot to his feet, indignant. You can't do this just because I said what everyone was thinking. But at that moment, Jade's voice rose from the back. And it's precisely what everyone was thinking that has pushed countless people to the margins just because they didn't look like what you consider acceptable. Brent clenched his bag, stepping back, but no one rose to defend him. Malik didn't stop. He turned to Noah. It's time. Initiate the Sky Corps protocol review all complaints related to denied access based on attire or perceived nonconformity. Begin auditing data from the past 12 months. Noah nodded, typing swiftly. Notice has been sent to the internal system. Legal confirms. You have full authority under Ethics Provision 9, Emergency Response to Systemic Discrimination. Jade lowered her camera, her eyes glistening. Jack Donnelly straightened in his seat, speaking without a microphone. I've flown with this airline for 15 years, but today is the first time I've seen real leadership happen mid-air. Malik nodded, his voice lower now. Leadership isn't about wearing a suit behind a desk. It's about calling out what's wrong even when it wears a uniform, appears in the manual, or hides behind the phrase, professional instinct. Candace stood motionless, her gaze locked into the space between the aisles. She had nothing left to say, and perhaps in that moment, even she understood the thing she lost wasn't a job, but the trust she had once been given, which she had let slip away. As for Malik Avery, this moment wasn't about retribution. It was, for the first time, about Seat 2A becoming the birthplace of a new policy where power would no longer be defined by priority tags, but by integrity. As the plane soared quietly toward O'Hare International Airport, most passengers in the first-class cabin remained still. No one stirred, no one ordered another drink or removed their headphones as they usually would. What was unfolding was no longer a personal dispute between a passenger and a flight attendant, but a revelation of an entire system where silence had once been trained, where professional instincts had long been considered unquestionable. Malik Avery sat back in Seat 2A, not to conclude the moment, but to initiate an audit not of documents, but of consciousness. And it wouldn't end with this flight. At cruising altitude, an internal broadcast from Orion Sky System reached the entire flight crew. Sky Corps protocol has been officially activated. All complaint records from the past 12 months will undergo cross-verification. Any notes lacking verification, any vague justifications for passenger exclusion will be reassessed. It wasn't a threat. It was the first declaration of a legacy in the making. Candace Nolan, who once believed a hoodie was enough reason to doubt a passenger, now sat quietly by the aisle, shoulders slumped, her headset lying next to the revoked staff ID. No one spoke to her. No one dismissed her. No one needed to, because she had seen herself through the eyes of everyone else. Lucas Powell stood in the back near the galley, eyes fixed on the tablet screen where he was reviewing past files, as if hoping to find some reason to say, I didn't know. But the truth was, he did. He just never spoke. And today, silence was no longer neutral. Jade slowly turned her camera back to Malik, but this time not as a journalist, as someone preserving evidence for a generation yet to come. You made them speak, she whispered, and made an entire airline rewrite how it sees human beings. Malik nodded gently, eyes fixed on the row ahead, where an elderly woman had just looked up, her hand over her heart, her eyes offering an unspoken thank you. He didn't know who she was, but he understood the gesture as if to say, I was once turned away, but today I witnessed justice. Noah Cruz remained focused, logging every conversation, every timestamp. I've sent the recordings to legal, he said. They're awaiting your landing to begin reviewing all previously filtered complaints. Malik nodded. But then, something unexpected appeared. An email from a former Orion Sky employee landed in his inbox. I watched everything from the lounge at JFK. I was the first to file a report about first-class passengers being targeted over their attire. Each of my 3 complaints was reinterpreted and closed. I left the company quietly. But today I'm ready to return, not to seek justice for myself, but to help you rebuild it from the ground up." Malik finished reading, eyes closing briefly. For years, as he built AV Holdings, he had believed that power was a tool to protect personal dignity. But today, he understood that real power was the ability to change an entire structure where the dignity of thousands had once been denied. And then, as if to mark an ending or perhaps a new beginning, the overhead PA system came alive. "Orion Sky, thanks you for flying with OS 117. We would like to announce that starting today, all passenger concerns will be logged directly without the need for crew validation. This is part of the new SkyCorps policy. Please let us know if you ever feel dismissed, because from now on, we are ready to listen." A few scattered claps echoed across the cabin. Not loud, but enough to say silence would no longer reign. The Orion Sky Boeing 787 touched down smoothly on the runway at O'Hare International Airport. The landing was so soft it felt as though the turbulence of the journey had been eased by the moment itself. The cabin remained silent, not from discomfort, but because everyone was waiting not for luggage, not for the seatbelt sign to turn off, but for one final word from the man in seat 2A. Malik Avery stood, adjusting the sleeve of his charcoal hoodie. No one moved. Even the flight attendants assigned to open the cabin door seemed to hesitate for a beat. He wasn't in a rush. What he did now was no longer reaction, it was affirmation. He turned to face the first-class cabin, his eyes resting briefly on each person. Candace Nolan, hair down, face pale, hunched near the galley. Lucas Powell, still holding the tablet displaying the internal inquiry form. Brent Halverson, who hadn't looked anyone in the eye since he was banned from future flights. And in seat 3B, Jade Lynn, still holding the camera, her gaze unwavering. "Before I leave this plane," Malik began, his voice not loud but steady, like the lingering hum of the engine beneath the fuselage. "I want to say one final thing, not as a shareholder, not as someone denied a seat, but as a man who has been asked dozens of times to prove that he belongs." He paused. The cabin remained completely still. "We've lived in a system where membership cards, tailored suits, and hairstyles have become the unspoken passport to respect. But starting today, that changes." Noah nodded behind him, a notification from the legal department confirming that the SkyCorps system had officially gone live. All passengers, staff, and crew would undergo retraining and bias recognition. No exceptions. Jade whispered, "You didn't just reclaim a seat. You reclaimed justice." Malik offered a soft smile, then added, "Respect isn't a reward for being well-dressed. It's a basic right owed to anyone who boards a plane, no matter what they wear, how they look, or how many shares they own." As the aircraft door opened, 2 compliance officers from Orion Sky stepped in. Candace rose slowly, handing over her name badge and credentials. She didn't look at anyone. Lucas remained still, awaiting confirmation of his reassignment. Brent was the last to be escorted off the plane, walking in the silent gaze of those he once judged. No words were spoken, but that silence served as the clearest evidence of consequence. Malik walked down the aisle, then paused at the exit. Beyond him was the airport, the press gathering outside after internal news had leaked, the future of an airline forced to wake from its slumber beneath power. He turned one last time to the now mostly empty cabin. "From today onward," he said, "no vague accusation will be overlooked. Every decision made on instinct will be reviewed against the data, and every person, every ticket will be seen through the lens of fairness." Jade lowered her camera. Jack Donnelly, the middle-aged passenger who had remained silent for most of the flight, stepped forward and shook Malik's hand. "You didn't just change an airline, you raised the standard for an entire industry." Malik smiled. "No, I simply reminded people that respect doesn't wear a uniform, and silence, from now on, is no longer a safe option." 3 weeks later, the footage from Flight OS 117 became the official opening segment in Orion Sky's new training material. 1 month later, discrimination-related complaints dropped by 68%. 6 months later, Harper received over 1,200 emails from passengers saying they had flown in t-shirts and jeans and for the first time felt seen as human beings. And 1 year later, in that familiar seat 2A, Malik Avery still wore a hoodie, still carried a backpack, still didn't wear a watch. But no one asked if he was in the wrong seat anymore. And that was the true beginning of the legacy called Skycore. From the perspective of an expert in leadership and organizational culture, I believe the most alarming thing isn't a mistake itself. It's a system that allows mistakes to persist in silence. Malik Avery didn't choose outrage, he chose action. He didn't let a business card speak for him, he let his actions do the talking. And it was precisely that calm, conscious resolve that set in motion a transformation, not only within one airline, but in the way society at large defines who is worthy. If this story made you reflect on fairness, on the right to be seen without having to dress the part, then like this video to help spread its message further. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can continue walking with us on journeys that expose injustice and reignite trust. And if you believe that respect doesn't require a suit, leave a comment. Worthy enough.